Chapter 7 of Life of Henry David Thoreau by Henry Salt. To avoid the need of too frequently breaking the continuity of the story of Thoreau's Concord life, it is convenient to group together some of the chief excursions made by him between 1846 and 1860. And first, as to his mode of journeying. The perfection of traveling, he thought, was to travel without luggage, and after considerable experience he decided that the best bag for the foot traveler is made with a handkerchief, or, if he study appearances, a piece of stiff brown paper well tied up. He would travel as a common man, and not as a gentleman, for he had no wish to spend a moment more than was necessary in the railway carriage, among the sedentary travellers whose legs hang dangling the while, or to be a prey to the civility and rapacity of the landlord of hotels. He preferred to journey on foot, and to spend the night in the homes of farmers and fishermen, where he could sit by the kitchen fire and hear the sort of conversation in which he was always interested. The cheapest way to travel, he wrote in the week, and the way to travel the farthest in the shortest distance, is to go afoot, carrying a dipper, a spoon, and a fish line, some Indian meal, some salt, and some sugar. When you come to a brook or pond, you can catch fish and cook them, or you can boil a hasty pudding, or you can buy a loaf of bread at a farmer's house for 4d, moisten it in the next brook that crosses the road, and dip it in your sugar. This alone will last you a whole day. He wore a shabby gray coat and a drab hat, and carried with him a piece of tallow for greasing his boots, for he no more thought of blacking these than his face. And many an officious shoe-black, he tells us, who carried off his shoes while he was slumbering, mistaking him for a gentleman, had occasion to repent it before he produced a gloss on them. He was better pleased when the farmers called out to him, as he passed their fields, to come and help in the haymaking, or when he was mistaken for a travelling mechanic and asked to do tinkering jobs, and repair clocks or umbrellas, or when, as once happened, a man wished to buy the tin cup which he carried strapped to his belt. Before starting on an expedition, it was his habit to procure all the available information from maps and guidebooks, and he often took with him a part of the large government map of Massachusetts. His pack was quickly made up, for he kept a list of the few necessaries that he carried, among which were sewing materials, a book for pressing plants, spyglass, compass, and measuring tape. He had learnt the art of camping out in his earlier excursions, and was well skilled in pitching a tent or constructing a hut at the shortest possible notice. On these occasions his favorite drink was tea, which he made strong and sweet in his tin cup, so that, as Channing hints, the traveler was not only refreshed, but grew intimate with tea leaves. He was fond of carrying with him a large slice of cake with plums in it, for he found that this furnished him with dinner and dessert at the same time. Thus simply equipped, he was practically independent of timetables and hotel lists, could roam wherever the fancy took him, and take his own time in his observation of the fauna and flora of the districts which he visited. Such expeditions were not only an agreeable change in themselves, but were a means of adding to his various collections and suggesting new subjects for his pen, so that it was natural that the pleasant experience which he gained in his week's jaunt in 1839 should have been repeated more frequently in later years. Cape Cod, the long sandy spit which was visited by Thoreau in 1849, and on several later occasions, is described by him as the bared and bended arm of Massachusetts, behind which the state stands on her guard with her back to the Green Mountains and her feet planted on the floor of the ocean like an athlete protecting her bay. All wild and desolate landscapes had an attraction for him, and he delighted in the dreary expanse of this long monotonous tract of shore, with its driftwood and kelpweed, flocks of gulls and plovers, and incessant din of waves. His accounts of these vast sandy tracts are extremely vivid and picturesque. The very dash and roar of the waves seem to be reproduced, as though we were reading, as the author suggests, with a large conch shell at our ear. It was amidst these surroundings that Thoreau, after witnessing the pathetic scenes that followed the wreck of an Irish brig at Cohasset, walked and meditated with a companion, Ellery Channing presumably, though the name is not recorded, in the wet, windy days of a stormy October. Day by day, it has been said, with his stout pedestrian shoes, he plodded along that level beach, the eternal ocean on one side and human existence reduced to its simplest elements on the other, and he pitilessly weighing each. They journeyed northward on the Atlantic side of the Cape, till they came to Provincetown at its upper extremity, avoiding towns and villages on their route, and spending the nights in the cottages of fishermen and lighthouse keepers, where Thoreau was several times mistaken for a traveling peddler. "Well," said an old fisherman, unconvinced by the explanations that had been offered, "it makes no odds what it is you carry, so long as you carry truth along with you." At Wellfleet, where the wayfarers were entertained in the hut of an aged oysterman, an idiot son of their host expressed his determination to get a gun and shoot the damned book peddlers, all the time talking about books. What might have been a more serious misunderstanding was caused by a robbery of the Provincetown Bank about the time of their visit to Cape Cod, for Thoreau learnt afterwards that the suspicion of the police had centered on him and his companion, and that their journey had been traced the whole length of the Cape. The volume on Cape Cod, parts of which appeared in Putnam's Magazine in 1855, and in the Atlantic Monthly in 1864, is deliberately formless in style, being interspersed with quotations from old histories and records of merely local interest. It abounds, however, in its author's dry, sententious humor and sparkling paradoxes. It has been said that Cape Cod is in one sense the most human of Thoreau's books, and has more tenderness of tone than Walden, as if the sea had exercised a mellowing influence on his mind. Especially good are the Dutch pictures of the Wellfleet oystermen and the sea captains of Provincetown. It is worth the while, says Thoreau, to talk with one whom his neighbors address as captain, though his craft may have long been sunk, and he may be holding by his teeth to the shattered mast of a pipe alone, and only gets half seas over in a figurative sense now. He is pretty sure to vindicate his right to the title at last. Can tell one or two good stories at least. In Cape Cod, the experiences of several visits are condensed into one account. On the 25th of September, 1850, Thoreau and Ellery Channing started on a week's tour in Canada, equipped each of them in the simple fashion which Thoreau adopted on his excursions. He avows that he wore his bad weather clothes on this occasion, and styling themselves accordingly, The Knights of the Umbrella and the Bundle. They first visited Montreal, where the church of Notre Dame made a great impression on Thoreau's imagination, as described by him in a very characteristic passage. It was a great cave in the midst of a city, and what were the altars and the tinsel but the sparkling stalactites, into which you entered in a moment, and where the still atmosphere and the sombre light disposed to serious and profitable thought. Such a cave at hand, which you can enter any day, is worth 1,000 of our churches, which are open only Sundays, hardly long enough for an airing, and then filled with a bustling congregation, a church where the priest is the least part, where you do your own preaching, where the universe preaches to you and can be heard. In Concord, to be sure, we do not need such. Our forests are such a church, far grander and more sacred. I think of its value not only to religion, but to philosophy and to poetry. Besides a reading room, to have a thinking room in every city. Perchance the time will come when every house even will have not only its sleeping rooms and dining room and talking room or parlor, but its thinking room also, and the architects will put it in their plans. Let it be furnished and ornamented with whatever conduces to serious and creative thought. I should not object to the holy water or any other simple symbol, if it were consecrated by the imagination of the worshippers. Footnote: Putnam's Magazine, 1853. End footnote. From Montreal they went on to Quebec, and thence to the Falls of St. Anne, 30 miles lower down the St. Lawrence. In the latter district they obtained lodging in a house where their French host and his family could speak but a few words of English, and they concluded that a less crime would be committed on the whole if they spoke French with him, and in no respect aided or abetted his attempts to speak English, a resolve which they carried into effect with some amusing difficulties. For in spite of his Gaelic extraction, a knowledge of the French tongue was not one of Thoreau's accomplishments, solving their frequent misunderstandings by writing on the table with a piece of chalk. What chiefly impressed Thoreau during his brief visit to Canada was the contrast between the imperialism of the Canadian cities, whose inhabitants appeared to him to be suffering between two fires, the soldiery and the priesthood, and the more homely, free-thinking independence of American life. The excursion to Canada, in which his experiences and impressions are related, was partly published in Putnam in 1853. It is certainly one of the least successful of its author's writings, for though it contains a few fine passages and interesting touches, it is overladen with description, the cities being, as Horace Greeley expressed it, described to death. "I fear that I have not got much to say about Canada," says Thoreau in his opening sentence, "not having seen much. What I got by going to Canada was a cold." The object of Thoreau's 3 excursions to the Maine woods, the wild district which lies at the extreme northeast of New England, was chiefly to gratify his strong curiosity and interest in the habits and character of the Indians. In September 1846, during his fortnight's absence from the Walden hermitage, he visited Maine, and in company with a cousin, who was employed in the Bangor lumber trade, made a voyage up the western branch of the Penobscot River, and descended Katahdin, one of the loftiest mountains of New England, over 5,000 feet in height. The paper on Katahdin and the Maine woods, which appeared in the Union Magazine in 1848, is a record of this expedition, and contains some vivid descriptions of the outlying lumber farms and log huts, the manufacture and management of the bateau, or bark canoe, by which they navigated the rapids of the Penobscot, their trout fishing extraordinary in the clear, swift streams which descend from the heights of Katahdin, and above all, the primitive solitudes of the Maine forests, which were still the haunt of the bear, the moose, the deer, the wolf, and other animals. Perhaps I most fully realized that this was primeval, untamed, and forever untamable nature, or whatever else men call it, while coming down this part of the mountain. We were passing over burnt lands, burnt by lightning perchance, though they showed no recent marks of fire, hardly so much as a charred stump, but looked rather like a natural pasture for the moose and deer, exceedingly wild and desolate, with occasional strips of timber crossing them, and low poplars springing up, and patches of blueberries here and there. I found myself traversing them familiarly, like some pasture run to waste, or partially reclaimed by man. But when I reflected what man, what brother or sister or kinsman of our race made it and claimed it, I expected the proprietor to rise up and dispute my passage. It is difficult to conceive of a region uninhabited by man. We habitually presume his presence and influence everywhere, and yet we have not seen pure nature, unless we have seen her thus vast and drear and inhuman, though in the midst of cities. What is most striking in the Maine wilderness is the continuousness of the forest, with fewer open intervals or glades than you had imagined. Except the few burnt lands, the narrow intervals on the rivers, the bare tops of the high mountains, and the lakes and streams, the forest is uninterrupted. It is even more grim and wild than you had anticipated. A damp and intricate wilderness, in the spring everywhere wet and miry. Who shall describe the inexpressible tenderness and immortal life of the grim forest, where nature, though it be midwinter, is ever in her spring, where the moss-grown and decaying trees are not old, but seem to enjoy a perpetual youth, and blissful, innocent nature, like a serene infant, is too happy to make a noise except by a few tinkling, lisping birds and trickling rills. In the autumn of 1853, Thoreau, accompanied by the same relative and by an Indian hunter named Joe Aitian, paid his second visit to the Maine woods, the lake of Chusancook being this time his destination. The paper entitled Chusancook, which was published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1858, is occupied in great measure with the subject of moose hunting, and contains, among other things, some characteristic reflections on the murder of the moose, in which Thoreau had been a witness and to some extent a participator. The Allagash and East Branch, the account of his third and final excursion to Maine in July 1857, at which time he had been in weak health for 2 years, forms the concluding portion of the volume afterwards published under the title of The Maine Woods, and is chiefly concerned with geographical topics, botanical specimens, and the character of Joe Polis, an intelligent Indian guide, from whom Thoreau derived much valuable information. As to Thoreau's courage and manliness, says Mr. Edward Hoare of Concord, who was his fellow traveler on this expedition, nobody who had seen him among the Penobscot rocks and rapids, the Indian trusting his life and his canoe to his skill, promptitude, and nerve, would ever doubt it. The following extracts from a letter addressed by Thoreau to Colonel Wentworth Higginson, in reference to a projected tour through the Maine forests to Canada, are interesting as showing with what precision and practical acuteness his expeditions were planned. Concord, 28th of January, 1858. Dear Sir, it would be perfectly practicable to go to the Madawaska the way you propose. As for the route to Quebec, I do not find the Sugarloaf Mountains on my maps. The most direct and regular way, as you know, is substantially Montresor's and Arnold's and the younger John Smith's by the Chaudiere. But this is less wild. If your object is rather to see the St. Lawrence River below Quebec, you will probably strike it at the Rivière du Loup. V. Hodge's account of his excursion thither via the Allagash. I believe it is the second report on the geology of the public lands of Maine and Mass in '37. I think that our Indian last summer, when we talked of going to the St. Lawrence, named another route, near the Madawaska, perhaps the St. Francis, which would save the long portage which Hodge made. I do not know whether you think of ascending the St. Lawrence in a canoe, but if you should, you might be delayed, not only by the current, but by the waves, which frequently run too high for a canoe on such a mighty stream. It would be a grand excursion to go to Quebec by the Chaudiere, descend the St. Lawrence to the Rivière du Loup, and return by the Madawaska and St. John's to Fredericton, or further, almost all the way downstream, a very important consideration. Perhaps you would like a few more details. We used, 3 of us, exactly 26 pounds of hard bread, 14 pounds of pork, 3 pounds of coffee, 12 pounds of sugar, and could have used more, besides a little tea, Indian meal and rice, and plenty of berries and moose meat. This was faring very luxuriously. I had not formerly carried coffee, sugar, or rice. But for solid food, I decide that it is not worth the while to carry anything but hard bread and pork, whatever your tastes and habits may be. These wear best, and you have no time nor dishes in which to cook anything else. Of course, you will take a little Indian meal to fry fish in, and half a dozen lemons also, if you have sugar, will be very refreshing, for the water is warm. To save time, the sugar, coffee, tea, salt, etc., etc., should be in separate watertight bags, labeled and tied with a leathern string, and all the provisions and blankets should be put into 2 large India-rubber bags, if you can find them watertight. Ours were not. A 4-quart tin pail makes a good kettle for all purposes, and tin plates are portable and convenient. Don't forget an India-rubber knapsack with a large flap, plenty of dishcloths, old newspapers, strings, and 25 feet of strong cord. Of India-rubber clothing, the most you can wear, if any, is a very light coat, and that you cannot work in. I could be more particular, but perhaps have been too much so already. Yours truly, Henry D. Thoreau. Mention has already been made of Thoreau's fondness for mountains. He possessed in a marked degree the instinct of topography, and with map and compass would make out his way unerringly through the wildest regions, and could run up the steepest places without losing breath. He ascended such hills as Monadnock or Saddleback Mountains, says Channing, by his own path, and would lay down his map on the summit and draw a line to the point he proposed to visit below, perhaps 40 miles away in the landscape, and set off bravely to make the short cut. The lowland people wondered to see him scaling the heights as if he had lost his way, or at his jumping over their cow-yard fences, asking if he had fallen from the clouds. In July 1858, he made another expedition with his friend Edward Hoare, this time to the White Mountains of New Hampshire, the Switzerland of New England, which he had visited with his brother 19 years earlier. They traveled by carriage, and Thoreau complains in his journal of the loss of independence, as regards choice of camping stations, which this method involved. It was not simple and adventurous enough to suit his tastes. He also disliked the mountain houses which were already erected in New Hampshire, with large saloons and other appurtenances of the city, for the supposed convenience of the tourist. "Give me," he says, "a spruce house made in the rain." Their chief exploit during the fortnight they spent in New Hampshire was the ascent of Mount Washington, the highest mountain in New England, where, in descending towards Tuckerman's Ravine, Thoreau lost his footing on the steep crust of a snow slope, and was only saved by digging his fingernails into the snow. They camped for several days in the plantation of dwarf firs near the foot of the ravine, and by the carelessness of their guide in lighting a fire, several acres of brushwood were burnt. The next afternoon, Thoreau sprained his ankle while scrambling on the rocks, and was laid up in the camp for 2 or 3 days. Monadnock, a mountain of nearly 4,000 feet, which is visible from Concord on the northwest horizon, had been visited by Thoreau, like Wachusett, in his early manhood. In 1858, a month before his excursion to the White Mountains, he camped a couple of nights on its summit in company with Mr. Blake, and 2 years later he again ascended it with Ellery Channing, who, being unaccustomed to mountain life, did not relish its inconveniences as much as his friend, but complains pathetically of the fatigue, the blazing sun, the face getting broiled, the pint cup never scoured, shaving unutterable, your stockings dreary, having taken to peat, and other similar discomforts. This visit to Monadnock was the last excursion of Thoreau's in which he camped out. The reasons which compelled the discontinuance of a practice in which he found such pleasure will appear when we resume the story of his life at Concord. End of Chapter 7.